There you go. I think I'm YouTube ready. So thank you very much. My live channel here. I do greatly appreciate it. So we talked last time a little bit about parts from China, and we talked a little bit about CA memberships and kind of that reconditioning time for a car. So I thought to myself, well, we had a little brief moment there where I talked about some of the cars I've owned in the past, and we talked a little bit about my little RX-7. Had a bunch of them back in the day because they were fun little cars to work on, and they were always kind of the shop orphan as far as that's concerned. So they were an easy car to come by that was affordable and something fun to drive. Can't really do that now. They're kind of a bit of a collectible, which is strange the way things work out. So I thought, let's do baby steps. And what is the first thing that comes to mind when you're going to go and decide to go on to Turo? Well, the first thing you're going to look at, and one of the things that I kept looking for, was a list of vehicles that would be Turo friendly and would be in my value point. In other words, the price I could afford, and something that I could justify getting into as taking a little bit of money and moving forward. Now, at the time, I needed to replace a car anyways. So I have a little PT Cruiser that I was running for the last, I didn't realize this, but I've had it for like 8 years. Like I bought it used, and I've managed to run this thing for a very long time, which is, if you read any of the reviews out there, apparently it's a horrible, unreliable, ugly car. And I never found that. I found with my little PT Cruiser, yes, it would go through tie rods, but they were $23. So they were cheap. Yes, I had to do a ball joint, which was a nightmare to do because Southern Ontario. And I had hoped never, ever to have to do a timing belt on that thing, which I never did because it would have been a nightmare. And I ended up owning 2 of them. So mainly because at one point I came across a convertible version and it was so cheap that I thought to myself, what's the worst that could happen by buying that car? Right. So PT Cruiser, good winter beater. Yeah, that's one of those things. So that's one of those things where it was getting to the point where it wasn't what I describe as super reliable at cold temperatures. And last year, I had to do an alternator, a few things that were outside in the winter, and I wasn't all that thrilled about that. So and I'm at that age where I don't want to be rolling around in a snowbank trying to look for a faulty ground wire or looking for something that's stupid, right? So that was at that point where we're at 200 and change in kilometers, and it was a 2002, so we're talking a 20-year-old car. That's, strangely enough, I still have. I've got it sitting in a storage area because I haven't been able to get rid of it. So it's one of those things where I've listed it on Kijiji, and I just get lunatics that seem to think it'd make a great fishing shack, actually. That'd be very affordable. You could drive out onto the lake, drill a little hole in the floor, drop your rod in. So maybe there's alternative uses for a PT Cruiser. So maybe we'll get into alternative uses because I'm going to have to find something to do with it as far as that's concerned. We'll go from there. So again, I digress. I just spent 3 minutes babbling about stuff. So let's talk about car choices. So what was I looking for in a vehicle for Turo? Well, for one thing, I used Audrey down in the US as a reference point as far as what her business is all about. Now, I think her business is a little different than most because I think she actually relies a fair bit on YouTube. I think she uses it as an income source, which is great. I think that's wonderful. And she does a little class that you can buy, I think, for about $750 Canadian. No, yeah, US, 750 US. Because I thought about it for a minute, but then I'm frugal and I thought to myself, well, I'm a genius. I can figure it out on my own. It's like having a manual. You don't read the manual. You just plug the thing in, you start going, right? So why would you do that? Again, if you're not familiar with running a small business, and maybe if you're not familiar with cars in general, maybe you need that background, maybe you need that assistance. I thought at the time, you know what, I can get away with it because I've got some automotive repair background. I've got a bunch of small businesses that I've had in the past. So I've managed to fail reasonably well in the past where I can recognize where I'm going to have an issue. So that's a great thing about failure. So maybe we'll have a discussion about how to fail and how to do that well. So again, it's one of those things where maybe we'll talk about it, maybe we won't. Maybe it's like bringing up little gremlins. We won't worry about it. But let's talk a little bit about how I selected my cars. So from a mechanical aspect of it, I was looking for something that wasn't a CVT. So that does reduce a fair bit of cars that are within the last 5 years. So if you're going to go to a new car, if you're getting a CVT drive, which is the transmission, the newer cars seem to be a little bit better than what they were 10 years ago. So a 10-year-old CVT has kind of a bit of a red flag for me, especially if it hasn't had the fluid changes or the filters done on a fairly regular basis. It's probably going to cause you an issue. A lot of that would be like a Nissan product, and they kind of migrate into a bunch of other products so you wouldn't realize it. So it's a good idea that if you're looking at a particular vehicle, uh, either pop the hood and look for a dipstick. And usually that'll tell you that's a classic transmission with gears. If it's a sealed transmission, we'll talk about that in a minute. But the CVTs are one of those things where it's not a drivability issue, because a lot of people say it's because you don't feel the shifting and it's muggy and it's kind of all over the place. That's not really the issue with it. The issue is the fact that the bands become damaged and they stretch, and it's a band drive. So think of it as like a great big giant elastic band around two big cylinders. Cylinders have a taper to them. The tapering is the gearing, right? So that's a simple explanation of what a CVT. It's more complicated than that, but it's kind of gives you an idea. So if that band has been running in dirty fluid, that dirty fluid acts like dirty fluid. It's gonna basically rough those drums down where the belt has been running, and you're going to have an issue with traction. The belt's going to slip, and there's not much you can do about that from that standpoint. And as the belt slips, it has this little wobble or a frequency to it, so you'll get a vibration beforehand. And usually what will happen is that belt will start to degrade as well, because it's snapping and it's kind of doing its thing. And at that point, there's not a lot you can do. And by belt, I don't mean like a rubber belt. It's not like that. It's going to be like a chain. So if you ever pulled something apart, like a CVT, and you had a good look at it, or you Google it, you're looking and kind of go, well, I've simplified it to the simplest sense of this is basically what it does. So concept-wise, like if you're a manufacturer, you go, well, okay, I've eliminated those gears. So that's a failure point gone. I've gone to two basic drums, tapered, cheap, easy, right? I've gone to a band, which is very affordable. So you've reduced the cost of that transmission substantially in the production end of it, and you've managed to make it into a universal piece, which means that you can go on a multitude of vehicles. Nissan would be a good example. So when you look at a Pathfinder, the CVT is essentially very similar in design and concept as you'd find in their little Micra. So it's one of those things that you look at and kind of go, okay, well, clearly they were hoping this to be a far more reliable piece. And if you do any consumer research, you're going to go, okay, clearly on the older ones, there's an issue attached to them. And again, I'm not knocking one particular manufacturer. If you do reviews, you're going to see that it'll probably focus on one, but they're all right across the board pretty questionable, especially as they get older. So just be prepared for that. Finding a shop to repair a CVT, just from the trade end of it, it's one of those things where it's a slippery slope. Like you kind of go, okay, well, as a tradesperson, if you're running a shop, you go, okay, well, let's pull it off. Let's have a little look. Maybe it's something simple. And usually that's not the case. Usually you end up pulling it apart and go, oh, wow, it grenaded. Look at that. There's nothing in there to really fix because it's destroyed. Like that's what happens to them. They don't just have a belt that slips a little bit, you put a new belt on. They don't just have a little issue where you kind of go, okay, well, let's refinish something and put it back together. It doesn't do that. So usually it's one of those things where it's like, well, let's go with the remanufactured. Remanufactured ones are usually a little bit on the questionable side because, again, they grenade when they go. So it's one of those things where there's not much really to kind of rebuild from that standpoint without it being very labor intensive. So you have to go to a new unit. And the new units are more than the cost of the vehicle. So you kind of go, well, just avoid that altogether. Don't buy a CVT. And with that, there's a grain of salt to it. So again, if it came with all the service records and it's your neighbor's car, you know it well, and you know they're not getting rid of it because it's slipping, you can kind of go from that standpoint. Fine. You know, it's worth the gamble if you kind of go that route. At the same time, be aware of the fact that it is a known failure point and a problem. So CVTs, I wanted to avoid them. With that said, I'm still fascinated by the RVR. I still like that. I'm still on the hunt for one. Not now because I picked up that little Cruze, and we'll talk about the Cruze in a minute because that was way out of what I was thinking anyways. But that's why I picked the Outlander, because it has a standard traditional 6-speed gear-driven transmission, which means that it's forgiving. If the previous owner didn't do a transmission service, I can do it. It's not a big deal. They'll go $200K, $300K, as long as they haven't been abused. reasonably well without any major problems. Right? And if there is a problem, typically it's reverse. And again, it's a relatively easy thing to fix. So it's one of those things where you kind of go, okay, I'm not getting into a $6,000 or $7,000 transmission to repair. I can take it to an independent shop. They can pull the pan down, and usually it's going to be something ridiculous. Um, Typically, on Mitsubishi transmissions, it's going to be the valve body. It's going to get contaminated. Then you're going to have an issue with it getting in and out of certain gears because the little valve body that controls the gearing gets jammed up and stuck. And then it throws the little computer into a panic mode, and then you end up having to limp the vehicle places. But again, not a complete failure. It's one of those things where that's maintenance and service, and you didn't change the fluids in time, you didn't do the filter, right? So that's one of those things with that. And usually, at least what I've found in the past, when I've had things come in and you kind of go, okay, well, it's got 175,000 kilometers on it. Clearly, it's past that transmission service, so there could be something major with it. Sometimes a drain and fill and doing a filter will resolve a lot of problems. So it's one of those things where sometimes it can be a very simple service and maintenance problem to get that transmission running. So that's why you want to go with a geared transmission. And there are some caveats to that. Honda has had some transmission problems, so you want to research the product you're getting into. Chrysler's had some transmission problems in the past, but again, usually they're pretty straightforward as far as getting in, and usually it's going to be a solenoid or something minor, but you still have to crack that thing open and fix it. So it's one of those things where you look at and kind of go, okay, go with a solid 4-speed, 5-speed, 6-speed transmission, mechanically driven, so it's easy to work on and service. So that kind of reduces some vehicles right there. The other one, timing belts, and this is where we're going to get into a maintenance item that on some of the older Japanese cars, and some of the domestics have them. So just be aware of that. They moved to them because they're cheaper to put on than a timing chain, and typically they're going to be in a car or a vehicle where my thought is the first owner usually isn't going to deal with it. So usually they're going to be around 160, 120 range kilometer wise, where you're going to change them up. That's kind of the norm. And usually it's because it skipped a tooth or there's something going on with it that people do it. If you're going to go into a timing belt driven car, you need to make sure that it's the tolerance is on it. So it's not going to have a piston strike into the valve train if the belt goes. If the belt goes, you want to be able to say, okay, well, that vehicle's never going to tap. And if it taps, you're into some expensive work. So you're looking at bent valves, so you're doing the head. You've run the risk of potentially damaging the cylinder wall. So again, that's one of the things that if I'm going to go with a timing belt car, I'm going to want to make sure that it's got a tolerance there that allows for that belt to break and not cause a grenading effect. So again, that's one of those things. It's on each individual car you need to check. Older Hondas, some of them are problematic in that regard, so they will strike. A nice thing with older Hondas, at least with Turo, is they're kind of out of the range. So they're usually before 2012. So it's one of those things where it's pretty rare. But it's one of those things where that's an additional cost. And the timing belt on some cars are very affordable. You're going to do the serpentine belt and water pump. Those are preventative maintenance items. You're in there anyways. Sometimes there's enough room right beside that little area where they've crammed all those parts to allow you to fit 2 or 3 fingers in. Kind of nice. You take the engine mount off. It's not that hard. So some of them, again, you got to do a little research, are not bad. So it's one of those things where timing belt isn't the end all be all of a car. It's not, don't buy it. It's one of those things where do a little research, double check, make sure that if it's been done, don't even worry about it. Make sure they did the water pump if it was attached to it. Make sure they did the other belts that are kind of, they're not in the timing area, but they've got to be pulled anyways. Same thing with belt tensioners and things along that line. If you're going to do it, spend a little bit of money and just replace everything that you're in there. But it's one of those things where if the car is clean and tidy and you've got service records with it, and you kind of go, okay, well, I've got to do a timing belt. That's why they're getting rid of the car. They don't want to spend $1,000 or the $2,000, which some shops do charge to do the timing belt. And you can kind of say, well, let's negotiate that price down a little bit, or maybe the price already is lower. And you can kind of incorporate that into the cost of running the vehicle with service. And you kind of go, okay, well, that makes sense. And you've now taken a check mark off the list of a car that really that's its only weakness. So timing chains. Timing chains are funny now because timing chains they've managed to screw that up a little bit. So if you're into a timing chain drive car, They're meant to be life of the vehicle. You're never going to get in there and do the timing chain. The dilemma is on the modern cars, and there's going to be a debate on why they did it. I'm not going to talk about that. It's just, it is what it is. They've gone to plastic guides to keep the timing chain steady and in position, and to stop it from making wonderful weird little noises or to jump a tooth, right? The dilemma is that if you've been changing the oil and you've missed an oil change, which not necessarily is the issue, but that sometimes is what gets brought up as, hey, this is the problem. You haven't done the right oil, or you have done the intervals have been incorrect or sporadic. That's where you want to look at the service history. It causes that plastic to wear, and to the chain riding up on it isn't lubricated properly. And next thing you know, the timing chain is gone. And you'll find that if you Google a few little cars out there, you'll go, oh, that's what that little on startup, that little jingle 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 is, or that little, and you think it's a valve train problem. It's not. It's a timing problem. And again, that's going to be an issue because today's modern cars are so sensitive when it comes to timing, as it's related to emissions controls and an aux sensor, a whole bunch of little things that you're going to get all these little weird little engine codes and quirks that'll come up with it. So it's one of those things where now you've got to incorporate getting into the engine, which usually when it's a timing chain driven car, manufacturers built it with the idea that you never ever are going to open it up. So traditionally it's like 18 hours just to get the cover off. So just be aware of that. Like usually it's going to be one of those staggering points where you go, wow, it's a $59.95 plastic part. It seems easy enough. I've been in that boat. You're going to go, oh, I have to remove the entire front end to get to it. Or they put the timing chain between the transmission and the engine. That's fun. Volkswagen Audi. So the Germans are weird about that. So just so you're aware. So whatever car you get into, make sure that the timing chain is not making a lot of noise. And to the most part, like if you're buying a bread and butter car like a Toyota Corolla or a Camry, or even some of the newer Hondas with it, or anything along that line, most of them are pretty good. And again, if they've had regular maintenance, it's not going to be a big issue. Corollas are kind of the bread butter of what I can see on Turo as far as A to B cars. The dilemma is that if you're going to go and try and do it on a cheaper budget, you're going to be looking at some of what I describe as the orphan cars, or the brands that don't get a lot of love, right? So Toyota, if you've got it in your budget, is a wonderful vehicle to get into as far as the brand is concerned. They're not as good as you think they are. In other words, the reviews hype them up quite a bit. And if you're out there doing any work on a Toyota, or you've been working on Toyota, you'll go, yeah, you're right. It is a little overhyped. It still breaks. It still needs maintenance. And a lot of folks will come in and say, oh, it's a Toyota. I don't need to do an oil change. What are you talking about? It's a Toyota. I don't need to change out the fluid. I don't need to do a coolant system service or make sure that it's not going to freeze at minus 40. What are you talking? It's a Toyota. You can drive it off of a cliff and it's perfectly fine. And to the most part, they are pretty decent. Like they do hold up really well, but be aware of it that they do require maintenance just like any other car. So if you're paying a premium for a brand, or it's a premium brand that you're paying for, make sure that the maintenance records are there and everything's been serviced properly, because it tends to be sketchy sometimes. And a lot of times it's not. It's going to go, it's been grandma's car. She's had it at the shop even before it needed an oil change every year, because they don't go anywhere. So it's one of those things where timing chain is the one I look for. Personally, I put that as a win, especially if the car's been maintained. If you're looking at things that are known problems, like for instance, a Cadillac, it's a beautiful car, but expect to have to do guides on some of those products. If you're looking at higher end exotic cars, you can expect to do guides on those products because they're driven a little harder. And for whatever reason, I don't know why, it's just every time I've gotten in one of those cars, it's always been a little bit of a jingle or something going on there when you get into a 5 or 10-year-old car. And sometimes you just keep driving and ignore it because it's just on startup and it may not be causing any issues, but it's one of those things that are going to be looming in the background. If that fails and you've got 100,000 kilometers and above, it might be to the point where you kind of go, unless you put some other things into the car, like rule of 3, you might go, well, it's not worth fixing the car, and then you're going to sell it off, and it's not going to get the money you'd expect. So one of those things just to be aware of, and we should probably talk about new car trade-ins because that's usually where they go. So usually the cars that have issues go to a new car dealer where they don't have to deal with the general public. They hand the keys in on their shiny new car and they go, good news, I got $5,000 for the car. Hey, never call me again. Right? So that's usually what happens with that. So if you're out there buying a car with Turo, source is important too. We'll talk about that in a minute. The other one is serviceability. So here's a good example. So I drive a Jag. It's not an expensive Jag. It's not a high-end Jag. It's an X Type from way back in the day, but I like it. And I got it from basically an estate sale, and it had really low kilometers on it. I thought it was, well, it was overpriced for what it was, but I thought based on the records that it came with, which were huge, and it had 80K on it, and everything had been done like dead on, and it had some little quirks to it, but it's stuff that I could work with. And it's a timing chain, standard gear transmission, not a manual, but it's got a 6-speed. That's a pretty easy one to work on. And it's a sealed unit. This is where we're going to talk about sealed units. So I thought that was a good value at the time, and that's why I got into that timing chain, right? So I don't have to maintain it. It's going to last for a long time. And it's a Ford-derived V6, so it's one of those things where parts are common and easy to repair. And when you look at the reviews online, it's one of those cars that kind of gets slapped around a little bit because it is quirky. The driveline is weird, but it's beyond that. It's just a Ford. Like, it's really an easy car to service and maintain from that standpoint. So that's why I got it. I like the leather interior, and I like some of the options. It won't qualify for Turo because it's too old, and it's like a hoopty. It's just one of those things I like. That's kind of the cars I kind of migrate to. But when you're looking at buying a car out there, those are the things you want to look for. Transmission type. What are we working with when it comes to timing, the belts or the chains? And chains are usually a little bit better to go for. And again, if you've got belts that you can service, great. It's easy to do. That's the route that I would look at. Now, the other one is all-wheel drive and front-wheel drive. Now, in Southern Ontario, where I'm at, the weather varies dramatically. So that's why I looked at my Outlander, because it's an all-wheel drive unit, and it's an all-wheel drive unit that only engages in the event of slipping. So in other words, it's predominantly front wheel the majority of the time. Because of that, and I look at the ownership of the vehicle was kind of, for the most part, in Toronto. It wouldn't have engaged very much. It would have been one of those things where, yeah, they came up to the cottage, or they did a run up to Owen Sound as a day trip, or they went to Wasaga Beach. Typically, you don't do that in the middle of winter, but if you were, you'd go, okay, well, it's only getting engaged 10 to 5% of the time in an environment where it's city driven. So you kind of go, okay, so that's great, limited wear. And that's exactly, when you look at an all-wheel drive system, that's the difference between that and a four-wheel drive. It's the wear and tear. So that's why I look at all-wheel drive vehicles in Southern Ontario, because of the weather change. Also because they do engage, again, as required. They have a dial, but no one ever really uses that. So unless you look and kind of go, gee, someone's dialed it into all-wheel drive 24 hours a day, it doesn't happen, because fuel mileage goes way up and it makes weird noises. So it doesn't happen. So on these crossovers or these unibody vehicles that you see as kind of your standard Hyundai Santa Fe, RAV4, all that stuff, most of them are all driven by front wheel, like 95% of the time. So that's a safe bet from that standpoint. And it usually gives you a little reduction in insurance, a little additional margin of safety, a little more cargo area. So that's where I look at. Now, when you get into all-wheel drive cars, it's different. So if I'm looking at a Rally Art, which is an all-wheel drive Mitsubishi by Lancer, or nice car, or an Evo, those are cars that are really different cars than what you'd be marketing for on my end, which is like a daily driver. Those are more of a specialty car. So they require specialty services. They require specialty parts. And when something goes sideways on one of those, ABS brake modules are pretty normal. Again, those things can cost you some money because they're driven hard, and usually they're using the full features. They're going to go out there and give that car a good run. So that's one of those things that I look at. Now, the other one that I like to go is when you look at 4x4, which you don't see a lot anymore. So usually there's a knob on the floor where you're going to go, okay, and it's going to engage all four tires. Are going to lock up, and you can go all terrain. So we're talking an older Jeep. We'd be talking a traditional Jeep, not the crossover SUV Jeeps, which are CVT. So again, that's a red flag on those ones. But when you get into something that's a little more four-wheel drive with the shift and everything, some GM models still have it. You have the buttons to push. Usually they're not bad, but you're into a different category. So you're going to be into a heavier vehicle. You're going to be into a pickup truck, or you're going to be into, again, a proper Jeep, or you're going to be into something that's really engineered for going a little bit off-road and a little harder. So usually towing and things along that line. That's a tough one on Turo. It's one of those things where not only are you getting a vehicle that potentially has a high dollar value to it as far as when you're purchasing it, so that's a drawback there. Trucks and Jeeps seem to be holding their value, so you're not seeing a huge drop in price from that standpoint. So you're going to pay a premium for it. The dilemma is that person that's renting that vehicle is probably renting it because they want to go 4x4. Makes sense, right? They probably want to haul a trailer. That makes sense. So it's one of those things where they're going to move a fridge. They're going to move something heavy. They're going to scratch stuff. They're going to mark stuff because they're using it as it was intended, a truck or a sport utility that's designed to be an actual all-wheel drive unit. They're going to want to go and play with it. And it's kind of the nature of it. Like if I rented a Hyundai Accent, I'm not going to go on the back trail. In a perfect world, that customer's not going to do that. If I go out and I rent a lovely, lifted Rutan, huge giant, SUV that's built and designed to go a little off-roading, I'm probably going to go out and just give it a little try, right? So I paid for it. I'm going to go for a little run, give it a little feel. Same thing with like the Jeeps, which I think you'll find if you do a little Googling down stateside that you'll get that Jeep recovery service from Turo, where someone has gone out to the back bush and gave it a good beating on that mall-kept, street-driven, Jeep that someone was in love with and spent time and energy cleaning it, maintaining it, and not getting mud or dirt on it. All of a sudden, you're getting it back and you're going, wow. Swamp run. 3 feet of water. It's designed for it. It should be fine. You're going to go, right? It's going to drive you nuts. The other one that's going to be an issue is that it has a hitch on the back of it. I know they say not to put trailers on, but someone's going to sneak it out and put a trailer on it. It's what's going to happen, right? So now you get somebody who's hauling a pop-up tent in the back with bad wheel bearings, crappy brakes, because it's not a daily for anybody. It goes out once every 7 years or something odd, right? And so you're going to get that. So again, all-wheel drive, I like. 4x4, questionable. So it's one of those things you got to look at. So that's kind of where you kind of go as far as looking at the mechanics of it. So really, it's a tough one out there to pick a car. And when you're looking at budget, it's one of those things where do you lean towards? So the thought on my part is gear-driven transmission, all-wheel drive. It's kind of a key thing. It's kind of a nice advantage. Gives you a little more money on tour, a little better selection. You want to go with something that's reasonably well equipped. You don't want loaded or top end because you want to be able to fix and repair things. So if you've got an air ride suspension, you've got a bunch of kit on that makes it really special. Those things are going to break. So that's why I went with the Outlander. It's fairly basic mechanically. It does have a timing belt. However, if it does have an issue, it's not going to cause that issue where it's going to hit anything. It's fine from that standpoint. And it's at that point where I've pulled the cover back and had a look. It looks like it's in decent shape. There's no shavings. So there's nothing there. So it's an okay belt, right? And odds are next year when we're at that timing belt range, which is about 160, I will probably just do a timing belt. It's not that hard. And I'll probably outsource that to a shop, or I'll get an independent garage or a shade tree mechanic, which I've been looking for. They're hard to come by today, but that's usually a shade tree mechanic is usually a technician that works at a franchise store that has a little garage in his backyard of his house, and he does the odd occasional favor for a friend. Now, usually that favor for a friend today now involves money, but usually it's a sideline hustle or an additional business, which if you find somebody like that, get their number. And usually I had a gentleman that worked at Ford that did that. And if he's out there, hi, Kevin. I still remember you. Yeah. His dad used to do work on cars on the side, and his dad was like a retired technician, but Kevin worked at the franchise store. So he rolled in as an employee. Hi there. You didn't want to work on your car because it was something reasonably substantial that would take some real shop time. You could farm it out to Kevin's dad, and Kevin's dad would do it. And now he still had a little shop and, build it appropriately for it. But it was one of those things where it was nice. And if you had an older car, which hats off to any seasoned technician out there, traditionally could diagnose the vehicle relatively quickly and usually would have a quick solution to something that would be, I'm not pulling a good example, not pulling the gas tank down to change over a fuel pump. The next thing you know, he's out there with a pair of tin snips and he's got the job done in 15 minutes, whereas it would normally be a 2-hour or 3-hour job. So it's one of those things where you kind of go, okay, that's the guy you kind of want if you're running a beater or a hoopty, not not necessarily Turo product. Like if you're in that 10-year or an 8-year-old car, still need to show it a little bit of respect. But sometimes you get in a life of car where you kind of go, it's a band-aid because the car really probably isn't going to last over a year. And if it does, it's like a miracle. That would be my PT Cruiser, right? And it just kept going. So that's kind of how I pick my cars from that. Where does that leave you as far as vehicle selection is concerned? It means you have to research each vehicle individually as far as the mechanics are there. Now, the other one that I like to talk about is we're up to 30 minutes, so we'll try and keep this a little shorter. Maybe I'll break this up into categories. So front wheel drive's okay. Rear wheel drive's okay. That's not an issue. Rear wheel drive hosts have a bunch of problems, though, in my region because the rear end's slippery in the wintertime. So you're going to probably have a vehicle go into a ditch. Front wheel drive is usually pretty safe. All wheel drive is what I look for because I find it to be, again, that little added margin of safety. And my little Chevy Cruze, I basically said, wow, I'm not going to listen to any of my advice. So, but mainly because the car was, and this is probably the downfall, the price point on it. When I looked at what the car had, and I a little familiar with it. So it does have a standard style geared transmission. So that's a win, right? When you're looking at the engine itself, it is a chain driven engine. So that's a win, right? Turbo, that's a negative. And the main reason being is that the turbo requires special services, and the turbos on anything that's out there, once it gets to be higher K, they're not really engineered to give you longevity, unfortunately. Now, that's different when you look at the older Volvos and a few other little things where they're there to supplement and to help with fuel mileage. They're not really there for raw power. But when you move into a 1 liter or a 1.5 liter engine, they're using it for powering the car to move it forward, especially on acceleration. So it means that turbo is going to get some wear and tear. So that's a negative on that car, and it's a big one. The other one is the reviews. So every component in there is made out of plastic or cost-cutting measures because it was an economy car. You can't sell it as anything more than I know GM sold it as a midsize or a compact, four-door sedan. But it's you open the hood, it's been done based on dollars and cents. So it's a turbo for a reason. It's a 1.4 for a reason. They've used plastic parts and components to keep costs down, right? So it's a car that was designed to make money, right? So the markup was there. So it's one of those things that because the cheaper components that were put into the vehicle, it's going to cost you some things. Now, on the great equalizer today, so as you move up into newer subcompacts and you move into newer compact cars, that's almost become the norm. So in other words, it's not exclusive to that particular car. When you look at a Ford, they've gone to plastic parts. When you look at Hyundai and Kia and all of them, they've all gone plastic parts. So again, the longevity of a car is questionable when you've got those components because they're not engineered to go to 285,000 kilometers without a replacement. Mini Coopers are a good example of that. So if you're a Mini Cooper owner, hi, you've probably replaced your water pump a couple times, and you've probably done a few other things that you went to yourself. Why? Right? Why? You made it out of Swiss cheese? Why? Right? And it's one of those things you look at, you kind of go, oh, they were trying to squeeze the dollars out of that car. So that's one of those things that you need to look at. Classic car, and it's slowly moved up to all the lines. So it's one of those things where you can't get around it, but that's one of the negatives as far as the Cruze is concerned. The other one is rust and corrosion. Cruzes, when you see them in Southern Ontario, lower quarters are really bad, again, because they didn't do a good rust proofing or a good paint on the bottom end of the cars. Again, cost cutting measures. With that said, if you got a vehicle that's been sprayed and oiled and old man took care of it, typically they're okay. But you really tell a car that's had that first life of a lease, so 4 years, turned back in because something was rattling. Remember that, right? So again, that's one of the issues. So that's where I'm going through this one and going, well, if I'd bought a car with a timing chain, geared transmission, front wheel drive, mid-sized economy, and I bought a Toyota or a Honda, which are high rated for serviceability and longevity, I would probably be paying $8,000, right? That's what it is. Safety, reasonable kilometers is going to be $8,000 to $10,000. That doesn't work with my budget. An SUV does. I can get into an SUV for that price point, which is weird. But a compact car still seems to hold those numbers. Whereas if I get into these little off brands or brands that are neglected or ignored, or you go online, you go, oh, okay, you shouldn't get into that. Like the Cruze is, for me, it's going to be a $3,000 to $4,000 car, so it's half the price. It means I can have a lower price point on Turo, and my costs are a little lower. So it means maybe I can run that car for a little bit and squeeze out, squeeze out some of the life of the car as a Turo vehicle. But I'm fully aware of the fact that that car is probably a 1 year to a 2 year vehicle to run. And I've got to stay on point on maintenance. I've got to go in, and every time it comes back, I've got to check all those plastic fittings, all those components to make sure they're not leaking or weeping or causing problems. I've got to run the OB2 code reader on it every single time, again, because I want to see if something has come up code-wise, not related to the person that's been driving it. It's just that sometimes it'll trigger something that I can address it before it goes out to the next person. So it's going to require more work as far as that's concerned. But everything else is standard, right? So that's why I went with that car, and it looks reasonably nice. So that's why I went there. And again, we're up to that 36 minutes, so we're going past the 30-minute mark. So we're going to stop talking at this point. I'm probably going to get into, again, this. I'm doing this live stuff as kind of a rant, or just a straight, no script, just kind of a conversation. I put a couple little hot points of stuff that I'd like to cover, but really it's more just a continuing discussion about things that you should be looking at when you're in Turo. Again, it's not meant to be high views. It's not meant to be, take over the world or anything like that. It's just meant to be able to say, okay, this is one guy out there, his opinion, and working away through Turo, and these are some of the stuff that I've been thinking or having to do or talk about. And narrowing down the car purchase at the first step was kind of it. Again, that's my business model, is to go with that entry level or that mid-range car, bread and butter, get you to work, do the tour, if you're vacationing, that type of thing. I'm not doing the high-end exotic. Mainly I don't have the budget for that. I couldn't buy a high-end exotic given what I'm working with dollars and cents wise. I couldn't afford to keep it maintained properly, so it's going to be an issue from that standpoint. I see that a lot on Turo. When you look at it, you kind of, oh, yeah, that's a lovely Mustang. It's maybe it's the top end model, and you kind of go, well, tires are already bald, right? It's one of those things where, of course, they are, because they've just been on Turo. Like, you rent a car, you're gonna, again, that's that same thing with the 4x4. You're gonna push it to the limit and give it a try, because that's what the car is. But it's one of those things that they don't seem to incorporate in the cost. So that's where that high-end luxury car is a struggling block for me. And maybe down the road, maybe I'll switch out. Maybe it'll be one of those things where, I give the economy car class a try. I give the SUV car class a try. And this is more of an experiment for me than anything else. Maybe I'll go out and say, okay, I'm going to go buy that luxury car I've always wanted, or that high-performance car that I've always dreamed about, which for me, it would be like a Volkswagen Karma Ghia from the mid-'60s. And that's not a Turo car, right? So it's one of those things where you kind of go, the stuff that's my hot button isn't the brand new Camaro. It's a nice car, but again, that's just from me hopping in and out of vehicles all the time. I kind of go, you go fast once or twice, and you kind of got it out of your system. Now it just wants to go fast. You know what I mean? Like, it's one of those things where I haven't been into a new car that's a high end exotic or anything like that, where I go, okay, well, this is the aspiration or the goal. Other than Mercedes makes a really nice little car called the 500. Yeah, that's nice. It's got massaging seats, which is an old guy I kind of like. So that's not true. If I'd won the lottery tomorrow and I had a ton of money, I would probably go buy a massaging Mercedes with a heated armrest and they got these little things that you put in the like little coasters, but they're scented, and they go into the air system, and they make it so the car smells like lavender. And there's also some special Mercedes blended perfumes you can put in there. That's kind of nice. So yeah, so maybe I'd do that. I've never really been into a Bentley, so maybe a Bentley is amazing. I don't know. So, but those, again, I'm off on a rant again. It's like 15 minutes of me ranting, which is why most of this stuff ends up onto a podcast, because I can kind of cut it down. So if you're interested in kind of having more of a synopsis, and you don't want to spend an hour or 45 minutes, and I do shoot for 30, so it kind of gives you an idea. I went over 10. That the podcasts are probably the route to go if you want concise information. And again, this is just off the cuff stuff, kind of as I come in from work. I want to kind of have a conversation and go from there. The other one that I'd probably look at, which would be great if you want to stay a little more informed, is to have a little PBS moment where we have a little conversation where I look into the camera and say, it would be very nice if you could subscribe to my channel, as I'm trying to get to that 1,000 subscriber mark. And I don't think hours of views is going to be an issue. If you're watching the entire thing, I should get to the required hours with YouTube fairly quickly. I don't think you're going to listen to the whole thing. You're going to fast forward and go, okay, that's the section I wanted to hear about. But I would really appreciate it if you subscribed, and that would help me move my channel up a little bit. Maybe I can start investing in things like perhaps a proper camera, or perhaps do a little more in-car stuff, because I use a Pixel 3 phone right now for doing in-car, and it works great, but it would be nice to have maybe a slightly better setup. So again, it's one of those things where by subscribing, it gives me that little push and saying, hey, we appreciate what you're doing. We acknowledge the fact that there is a little bit of a skill set that's missing. And it would be great if you could take some of that high-end energy and top money that you get from YouTube and put that into a proper camera, proper setup, go from there. Maybe even send this out to get edited, because I'm not doing that. I'm literally just doing these live things and then throwing them up. All right. So again, that's where subscriptions will help me from that standpoint. So that's the PBS moment. Help support a Canadian. Please subscribe. The other one I actually like is comments. So if you're watching this thing, you kind of go, oh dear. Oh dear. And you got an idea and you like to put it in a little chat thing. As long as it's nice and clean and constructive, I'm happy with that. And if you're a tour operator and you're in Canada, and you kind of go, Keith, you know what? Wow, I remember doing that, and that's not what happened at the end of that story. So you might want to throw a little comment there, or maybe send off a link of maybe you've got a YouTube channel that would be supportive, or something I can kind of say, okay, well, that makes sense. Let's go with that. That would be great. I'm also looking for feedback from creators. So if you're out there going, you know what, I get the live thing. It's easy. Hit the button. Done. You know, clearly I've spent the money on studio space. This is my 3D workshop. So again, and some of the artwork I've done. So it's not where I've built anything special for it. And again, if you subscribe or you give me a little feedback, maybe it'll motivate me to bump it up a notch and go a little bit further. So I do appreciate it. Thank you very much. Have a pleasant and enjoyable day. Let's hit that button. There we go. End stream. Wow. Okay. And we're going to go to not yet. No. We're going to go to end.